Welcome to our channel. In this video we will review some of the most famous explorers in history. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for future updates. People on opposite parts of the world had little knowledge about other nations and cultures in pre-modern times. All of this was transformed by the famous explorers of the Age of Discovery. With this list of the most renowned explorers in history, let's start with the pioneering explorers. Tasman Abel. He was a Dutch adventurer who worked as a captain for the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. He is most known for his trips to the South Pacific Ocean in 1642 and 1644. He discovered Fiji, New Zealand, and Tasmania during these expeditions. Tasman did not, however, name Tasmania after himself. In reality, the island was initially named Van Diemen's Land for his corporate benefactor, Anthony Van Diemen. Under British occupation, the island did not receive its contemporary name until 1856. Despite his historical achievements, the Dutch East India Company was disappointed by Tasman's discoveries. This was due to a scarcity of easily exploitable resources or chances for large-scale trade. Tasman eventually retired to Batavia, which became Jakarta, and died in 1859. Albuquerque, Alfonso de Albuquerque, a Portuguese military officer, rose to prominence as Viceroy of Portuguese India in the early 16th century. He traveled to South Asia with the intention of combating Muslims, propagating Christianity, and providing Portugal with direct access to the Orient's spice trade. Historians usually regard him as the greatest naval leader of his generation, especially for commanding the first European fleet to sail into the Red Sea. He also raided the Persian Gulf beaches, attempting to block off Muslim access to the maritime passages flowing into and out of the Indian Ocean. Another highlight of his military career was the conquering of Goa in 1510 and Malacca in 1511. Alfonso also demonstrated his abilities as a civilian administrator outside of the military. During his presidency of Portuguese India, he established diplomatic ties with Burma, Ethiopia, Persia, Siam, and Timor. He also collaborated with Rafael Perestrello to persuade Ming China to consider opening up to European trade. De Albuquerque's numerous accomplishments earned him multiple epithets after his death, including the Great and the Terrible. According to some historians, he was known as the Caesar of the East, the Lion of the Seas, and the Portuguese Mars. Ojeda, Alonso de Ojeda was a Spanish conquistador who lived between the late 15th and early 16th century and was well known for his excursions across South America. In truth, de Ojeda was a member of Christopher Columbus's later trips to the New World. As a result, de Ojeda joined Amerigo Vespucci's travels to what would become Venezuela. De Ojeda eventually became a conquistador in his own right, with the King and Queen of Spain's approval. This led to him exploring the South American coastal regions that would eventually become Colombia and Guyana. He also visited several Caribbean sea islands, including Aruba, Curaçao, Trinidad, and Tobago. De Ojeda, ironically, would later be caught and shipwrecked by pirates. As a result, he made the decision to retire in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. De Ojeda's experiences near the end of his life also prompted him to repent for the myriad atrocities he performed as a conquistador, such as enslaving, killing, and plundering indigenous. De Ojeda clearly requested in his will that his body should be buried beneath the door of the Monasterio de San Francisco. He may atone even after his death by allowing visitors to the monastery to tread over his tomb. Vespucci, Amerigo. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine adventurer who flourished during the mid-15th and early 16th centuries, gave the Americas their name. Many historians, ironically, question whether Vespucci even visited the Americas at all. This is due to the fact that all of his allegations are based on a succession of confusing letters. Most historians, on the other hand, accept them as fact or believe that Vespucci deserves the credit anyway. They point to his letters in particular as having grabbed the public's imagination. After seeing what would become Brazil, Vespucci was the first to adopt the term the New World. He was also the first to recognize that their findings were not just vast islands, but entire continents. Beginning in 1507, map-makers such as Martin Waldseemüller were inspired to name the new continents after Vespucci. However, historians are dubious whether Vespucci was aware of the distinction before his death in 1512. Durabru, Antonio. Durabru was a Portuguese officer who served under Alfonso de Albuquerque between the late 15th and early 16th century. He rose to prominence after leading an expedition to the mythical Spice Islands in 1511. Durabru made his journey to what would become Indonesia with the assistance of native Malays. Before reaching the Bunda Islands in 1512, he explored the Lesser Sunda Islands, as well as Java and Ambon Island. He was able to collect a cargo of nutmeg and cloves there before returning to Malacca to inform de Albuquerque of his success. Durabru intended to return to Portugal following that, and he did so in January 1513. Unfortunately, he perished on the Azores Islands from unknown causes before he could arrive. Diaz Bartolomeu. Diaz, one of the most famous explorers of all time, was born in 15th-century Portugal. Diaz served on many trading missions to and from West Africa before becoming an explorer in his own right. He may have even participated in Diogo Causa's first journey to the Congo, which took place between 1482 and 1484. Diaz, on the other hand, embarked on his legendary expedition in 1486, with the approval of King John II of Portugal. The king desired a marine passage to the Orient because the Ottoman Empire had barred the land routes. As a result, the Venetians effectively monopolized all trade between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The monarch and his councillors questioned if they could discover that way by circumnavigating Africa and heading south. Diaz left Lisbon in July 1487 and travelled down the African coast until he arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in May 1488. Because of the severe weather at the time, he named it the Cape of Storms, but the monarch renamed it to its contemporary name instead. Diaz acquired a noble title in acknowledgement of his exploits and later travelled to Brazil and India. Diaz, however, died on his way back home in 1500, when his ship was sunk in a storm near the Cape of Good Hope. Columbus, Christopher. The most famous, if not the most notorious, explorer of all time, depending on who you ask. Christopher Columbus, an Italian adventurer who worked under King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Spain, discovered the New World in 1492. He landed in the Bahamas, namely on the island he named Hispaniola, the exact location of which is still debated among historians today. In subsequent excursions, he visited numerous other Caribbean sea islands before landing in Central America in 1502. However, Columbus fell out of favor with the royal court in 1502 due to his poor performance as a colonial governor. He was extremely brutal, even by the standards of the day, which led to his imprisonment and return to Spain. Columbus has a mixed historical reputation today. On the one hand, his discovery of the Americas paved the way for Western Hemisphere exploration and colonization. On the other hand, it facilitated enslavement and genocide against Native Americans. Diogo. An early age of discovery explorer, arrived in the late 15th century from Portugal. While not as well known as other subsequent explorers, Causa's travels helped set the ground for their success. In particular, visited Africa's west coast and erected the Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast. This was the oldest European structure south of the Sahara Desert, and it acted as a trading and resupply post. From there, he continued to explore the coast, eventually reaching the equator in 1482. This defied prevalent beliefs at the time that any man attempting to cross the equator would be burned to a crisp. Causa ultimately arrived at the Congo River and sailed up the river to enter the African interior as far as current Matadi in 1485. Causa continued to explore the African coast until 1486, when he perished in what is now Namibia. Magellan, Ferdinand. Magellan, another of the world's most famous explorers, is credited with being the first man to circumnavigate the globe. He hailed from Portugal, but moved to Spain after King Manuel I rejected his suggestion to locate a western path to the Orient. King Charles I of Spain, on the other hand, was open to the idea, noting how a western route would allow Spain to avoid Portugal's stranglehold over the Indian Ocean. Magellan departed Spain in 1518 and traveled to South America's Patagonia. Magellan made his journey down the coast, discovering Cape Horn and passing through the straits named after him into the Pacific Ocean. Magellan gave the newly discovered ocean that name because of its calm and tranquil weather. Magellan arrived in Guam and the Philippines in 1521, converting the first Christians in the latter. This, however, earned him enemies among the indigenous, including the tribal chief Lapalapu. Magellan was killed during the Battle of Mactan. It is unclear how he died. Some claim he was killed by a poison arrow, while others claim he was killed by Lapalapu himself. Captain Juan Sebastián Elcano led the remnants of the fleet back to Spain, where they arrived in 1522. Despite never finishing the expedition, Magellan was awarded the accolade of becoming the first man to circumnavigate the globe after his death. Sir Francis Drake. An Englishman who lived in the 16th century, Drake mainly is recognized for his part in leading the Royal Navy to victory against the Spanish Armada. Prior to it, he was well known for his raids on Spanish vessels in the Pacific, as well as on Spanish colonies in North America. Drake did, however, make contributions as an explorer. His 1577 expedition around the world, in particular. He became not just the first Englishman, but also the first man to achieve so in a single voyage. Magellan and others before him took several pauses along the journey, but Drake continued sailing until he arrived in England. Later, when fighting the Spaniards in the Caribbean Sea, Drake died on his ship, and his crew buried him at sea in a lead casket. Divers have yet to uncover Drake's grave, despite official records placing it in the water off the coast of Portobello in Panama. Sorao Francisco. Circumstantial evidence implies that Sorao, a Portuguese adventurer from the early 16th century, was related to Ferdinand Magellan. In 1511, he went off on an expedition to find the Spice Islands under the command of Alfonso de Albuquerque. His trip followed in the footsteps of another explorer, Antonio Durabru. However, Durabru held a higher position than Sorao. Sorao, like Durabru, relied on native Malays to take them to Java and subsequently Ambon Island. He married a native woman on Java, and she accompanied him for the rest of his career. Sorao was later shipwrecked while leaving Ambon Island, but he survived and made it to Banda. There, he was able to obtain a Chinese junk as a replacement vessel, only to be shipwrecked again in the Maluku Islands. Sorao and his men thereafter became mercenaries, selling their services to Ternet's sultan. Their accomplishments earned the sultan's trust and esteem, and Sorao was subsequently appointed as one of the sultan's counselors. This prompted Sorao to choose to live on Ternet, where he died in 1521. This happened to be the same year that his cousin Magellan perished in the Philippines. Wallen, Georg August. Wallen was a 19th-century Finnish explorer who became well known for his expeditions across the Middle East in the 1840s. He was the first European to tour the Middle East with the benefit of scientific research. Most European tourists at the time relied solely on common information or prejudices. Before leaving, Wallen, on the other hand, thoroughly researched previous scholarly study on the region's culture and politics. He even disguised himself as a Muslim, going by the Arabic name Abd al-Wali, sparking reports among his contemporaries that he had converted to Islam. This permitted him to visit Mecca, which was then and still is forbidden to non-Muslims. His publications and discoveries throughout his travels garnered him recognition in Europe, including a chair at the University of Helsinki. Wallen, ironically, considered Europe stifling in comparison to the Middle East and lamented his inability to return to the Middle East due to his worsening health. He died in 1852, only 3 years after returning to Finland. Cortes, Hernan. Cortes' name has been linked with the Spanish conquistadors, making him the most infamous explorer of all time. Born in Spain in 1485, he moved to Cuba in 1504 to fight against indigenous resistance to colonial power. Then, in 1518, he launched his own expedition to Mexico as a conqueror in his own right. He met La Malinche, a native woman who converted to Christianity, soon after his arrival. She became Cortés' mistress, interpreter, and advisor, and historians believe that Cortés would not have succeeded without her help. Cortés, on her suggestion, joined with Aztec foes such as the Totonacs and Tlaxcalans, among others. This provided him with the manpower he required to seize Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire's capital, which he called Mexico City. Even at the time, Cortés was known for his ruthlessness, particularly his slaughter of local nobles. His victorious conquest of the Aztec Empire, on the other hand, led to his appointment as governor of New Spain. It also garnered him his peers' envy, which eventually led to multiple conspiracies against him. This resulted in his repatriation to Spain in 1528, after which he returned to Mexico in 1530. In 1541, he returned to Spain and fought for Spain in North Africa. Cortés died of illness in Seville in 1547. Hudson, Henry. Hudson, an English adventurer from the early 17th century, was one of several individuals pursuing the northeast and northwest passages. These routes were supposed to follow the northern shores of Eurasia and North America via the Arctic. Finding them would allow England to avoid the commercial routes dominated by the Spanish and Portuguese to the south. Hudson attempted to find the Northeast Passage twice, in 1607 and 1608, but failed both times due to impassable ice in the Arctic. He returned to North America in 1609, this time under the Dutch East India Company, to find the Northwest Passage. He failed, although Hudson did complete the first extensive survey of the New York coast, including a trip up the Hudson River. Naturally, the river was named after him as a result. Hudson found both the Hudson Strait and Hudson Bay in what would become Canada on his final journey in 1611. He wanted to keep going west, but his crew refused and demanded that he turn around. The crew mutinied when Hudson refused, marooning Hudson, his son, and their few other allies. Hudson and his pals were never seen again. Although the crew was arrested and prosecuted for mutiny, they were all acquitted because their bosses valued their expertise and knowledge too much. Cartier, Jacques. Cartier was a French adventurer who gained famous for becoming the first European to explore what would become Canada. He mapped the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River in particular. He even named the territory Canada after the Iroquois names for the principal settlements in the area. Between 1534 and 1542, Cartier led 3 journeys to North America before returning to France permanently. During that time, he established other colonies, including Charlesbourg Royal, but they only lasted a few years. There would be no permanent European settlements in North America until 1605, when Port Royal was established in what would become Maryland, USA. Cartier died in St. Malo, France, in 1557, during a typhoid disease epidemic. Picard, Jacques. Picard, a 20th-century Swiss oceanographer, gained famous for exploring one of the globe's few surviving wilderness, the undersea realm. He was particularly involved in the U.S. Navy's Challenger Deep expedition in 1960. Picard was already well known for his work on the bathyscaphe, a submersible exploration vehicle. Picard's family was particularly well known for their work on balloon research and development, which he applied to his bathyscaphe, the Trieste. Picard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh sailed the Trieste into the North Pacific Ocean in 1960. They descended an estimated 10.9 kilometers to the Marianas Trench, the lowest spot on Earth's surface, not just in the ocean. They stayed for 20 minutes, only returning when the high water pressure began to crack the windows of the Trieste. Picard intended to return to the Marianas Trench in the future, but financial constraints compelled him to abandon such plans. Cook, James. Cook was the most famous British explorer of all time, serving in the Royal Navy during the 18th century. Between 1768 and 1769, he conducted 3 expeditions, charting the New Zealand coastline as well as the east coast of Australia. He also demonstrated that, contrary to popular belief at the time, Australia had no geographical connection to Antarctica. Cook was also the first European to make contact with the Hawaiians, while not being the first to reach Hawaii. While Cook initially had amicable discussion with the Hawaiians, his repeated demands on them soon strained ties. Cook's decision to use Hawaii as a supply depot for his ships while exploring the Pacific Ocean resulted in this. This resulted in a falling out in 1779, which turned violent and resulted in Cook's death. Surprisingly, despite their feud, the Hawaiians still revered Cook and regarded his body as that of a worthy foe. They embalmed his body using conventional procedures before returning it to Cook's crew, who buried him at sea. Cabot, John. Cabot, an Italian explorer from the 15th century, undertook an expedition to North America in 1497 with King Henry VII of England's help. This was the first time Europeans set foot in North America since the Middle Ages Vikings. However, historians know almost little about Cabot's first expedition, other than that he may have discussed it with Christopher Columbus. His second expedition, on the other hand, is supported by documents. However, the precise place of Cabot's landing remains unknown. Cape Bonavista and St. John's, both in Newfoundland, are possible places. There's also Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, Labrador in Canada, and Maine in the United States. In 1498, Cabot made a third trip, but he and his fleet went missing. Some historians argue that the records were simply lost, citing the fact that some of Cabot's crew were still living in London in the 1500s. Scholarly investigation regarding Cabot's demise continues to this day. José de la Causa. De la Causa, a 15th-century Spanish adventurer, accompanied Christopher Columbus on his expeditions to the New World. This enabled de la Causa to create the first European maps of the Americas. The Spanish monarchy later attached de la Causa to Alonso de Ojada's missions as a result of his experience with Columbus. De la Causa took advantage of the opportunity to fine-tune and update his maps before joining another expedition led by Rodrigo de Bastidas. De la Causa eventually led his own expedition to the Pearl Islands and the Gulf of Uraba between 1504 and 1506. Before returning to Spain, he went to Jamaica and Haiti. Following that, he joined de Ojeda on an expedition to Colombia, where de la Causa was killed in battle against indigenous. His death enabled de Ojeda to retire and reassemble his soldiers before launching an assault. De Ojeda later honored de la Cosa's sacrifice by bringing his widow 45,000 maravedis and several native slaves. Ponce de Leon's. Among the Age of Discovery explorers, de Leon has the most legendary reputation, thanks to his quest for the fabled Fountain of Youth. In actuality, de Leon served under Christopher Columbus, prompting the Spanish monarchy to send him to conquer Puerto Rico later on. His achievement earned him the position of governor, but it also landed him in legal difficulties with Columbus's son, Diego. De Leon eventually resigned as governor, and the Spanish monarchy compensated him by providing him permission to explore the Caribbean Sea. During this voyage, de Leon discovered Florida, which he named from its abundant plant life. His quest for the Fountain of Youth is centered on this expedition, however historians have uncovered no evidence of such a quest. De Leon returned to Spain in 1514 before sailing to Florida to establish a colony in 1521. De Leon died from fighting injuries after failing in the face of native resistance. The Spaniards buried him in the Cathedral of San Juan Bautista in Puerto Rico. Elcano, Juan Sebastian. He was a 15th-century Spanish sailor who sailed under Ferdinand Magellan on his historic expedition around the world. After Magellan was killed in battle in the Philippines, Elcano took command of the fleet and led it back to Spain. Nonetheless, Elcano's existence remains one of history's great mysteries. This is due to the fact that few records of his life exist from his time. Even the first official biographies of Elcano's life are from the 19th century. In other words, 3 centuries after Elcano lived and died. Historians do know he was born in the Basque region of Spain. They are also aware that upon his return, Emperor Charles V publicly praised him for his accomplishments. Later, he joined another voyage to the Orient led by Garcia Joffre de Loaisa. Both de Loaisa and Elcano died while crossing the Pacific. Only a few of their sailors made it back to Spain. Erik Eriksson. Eriksson, also known as Leif the Lucky, is now regarded as a folk hero in his native Scandinavia. Most ideas lead to Iceland, which had recently been invaded by Norwegian Vikings in the 10th century. Eriksson grew up to be a Viking, sailing west over the Atlantic to become the first European to set foot in North America. This occurred at the end of the 10th century, around 500 years before Columbus found the New World. Eriksson also established a Norse colony in North America called Vinland, which did not endure long. In addition, the Norse made no long-term endeavors to return to and conquer North America. Historians are confused where Vinland stood, with some even questioning its existence. Nonetheless, archaeological evidence in Newfoundland suggests the presence of a Norse settlement. Eriksson's name has gained recognition outside of Scandinavia in recent decades. Beginning in 1929, Wisconsin was the first state to recognize October 9 as Leif Eriksson Day. In 1964, Congress also gave the president the authority to designate October 9 as Leif Eriksson Day every year. Finally, on October 6, 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton declared October 9 to be Leif Eriksson Day in perpetuity. Marco Polo's. Polo, a Venetian merchant from the 13th century, became famous for his travels over the Silk Road, which connects Europe and China. He arrived around 1269, during the reign of the Yuan dynasty. Polo gained Kublai Khan's trust and was appointed as an imperial emissary to adjacent territories. This allowed him to observe China and adjacent countries firsthand. Burma, India, Indonesia, Japan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Persia were among them. Polo eventually returned to Europe in 1295, where he died in 1324 in his native Venice. Although Polo was not the first European to visit China, he was the first to record in detail what he saw and experienced. This provided Europe with its first scholarly allusions to the Orient's cultures, geography, politics, and resources. It also encouraged later explorers such as Christopher Columbus to seek out ways to reach the Orient. Moreover, with the fall of the Yuan dynasty came the development of new Muslim nations such as the Ottoman Empire. The Silk Road was cut when Muslims attempted to control all trade between China and Europe. As a result, Europeans were obliged to find new ways across the sea to access the Orient. Cabral, Pedro Álvares. Cabral, a Portuguese adventurer from the 15th and 16th centuries, is credited with discovering Brazil. He was also the first person to walk across all 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. Cabral's famous journey to Brazil departed from Portugal in March and arrived in April. Cabral initially assumed he'd find a vast island, but as he charted the shoreline, he realized he'd discovered a new continent instead. Eventually, a severe storm destroyed his fleet. Cabral was compelled to reverse course and head for Africa, where he rounded the Cape of Good Hope. From there, he sailed around the east coast before arriving in Calicut, India, in September. They were ambushed by Muslim traders who had become suspicious of European traders who had arrived in India by water. Despite the Muslims' overwhelming numbers, Cabral won the battle thanks to his stronger naval cannons. This was the first time in history that gunboat diplomacy was used. Cabral then returned to Portugal, where he made plans to return to India with a conquest fleet. However, ill health and legal complications caused him to abandon his ambitions. Cabral passed away in Santarém, Portugal, in 1520. Amundsen, Roald. Amundsen, the most famous explorer of the modern age, made history by being the first person to reach both the North and South Poles. In reality, he initially attempted to reach the poles in 1897, while serving under Adrian de Gerlache. Although de Gerlache's expedition failed to reach the South Pole, Amundsen persisted on his own. The Amundsen expedition set off from Norway in June 1910 and arrived in Antarctica in January 1911. He then spent months stockpiling supplies before embarking on his historic overland journey in October and reaching the South Pole in December. Amundsen later tried to reach the North Pole by water in 1918 but failed. This prompted him to shift tactics, and in 1926, Amundsen and 15 other men used the airship Norge to reach the North Pole. Unfortunately, Amundsen went missing 3 years later while attempting to rescue a stranded airship, the Italia, in the Arctic. The search for his remains is still ongoing. Champlain, Samuel. De Champlain, a 16th and 17th century French adventurer, is best known as the founder of Quebec and New France in what would become Canada in 1608. He was also a founder member of Port Royal in 1605, near contemporary Annapolis in Maryland, USA. De Champlain also explored North America's interior and was the first European to reach the Great Lakes. He also made contact with and formed friendly relations with many Native American groups. The Algonquin, Innu, Montagnais, and Wendat were among them. He also aided them in their fight against the Iroquois during the Beaver Wars. De Champlain was studying Native American culture at the time and eventually published his findings. De Champlain resided with the indigenous until 1620, when he was summoned to Quebec to take up an administration position. He kept that position until his death in 1635, and historians are still debating his final resting location. Vasco da Gama's. Da Gama, a Portuguese explorer from the 15th and 16th century, rose to prominence after following up on Bartolomeu Diaz's earlier trip. Da Gama continued on to the Cape of Good Hope, where Diaz had previously turned back. He mapped friendly places off Africa's east coast before sailing east across the Indian Ocean to Calicut, India. This marked the completion of the first all-sea route between Europe and Asia. It also ushered in the age of colonialism, when Portugal began to militarize and monopolize the Indian Ocean's naval lanes. Other European countries followed suit, with Spain establishing its own connections to the Orient via the Pacific Ocean. Both Spain and Portugal fought for control of South America, with Spain dominating Central America. Spain also competed for North America with England, France, and the Netherlands. Da Gama also used a lot of force, like indiscriminate artillery bombardment and kidnappings, to coerce local rulers to give in to his demands. This, too, set a precedent for European imperialism and colonization in the decades that followed. Vasco de Balboa. De Balboa was a 14th and 15th century Spanish adventurer who became famous for his 1513 expedition across Panama. As a result, he was the first person to reach the Pacific Ocean from the New World. In what would become Colombia, he also established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas, Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. De Balboa rose through the ranks to become governor of Veragua, a Spanish province in Central America. As governor, de Balboa became notorious for his harshness, particularly for torturing and killing locals convicted of homosexuality. He also met his gold requirements by forcibly taking native women's jewelry. However, de Balboa eventually found himself in a power conflict with another colonial officer, Pedro Arias de Avila. This led to his arrest and execution in 1519 for treasonous conspiracy. Vescovo, Victor. Vescovo, a modern-day explorer, rose to prominence in 2018 with his 5 Deeps expedition, which planned to survey the ocean floor by September 2019. By August 2019, he has accomplished this aim while simultaneously gathering biological and geological samples with each dive. In December 2018, Vescovo descended to the Atlantic Ocean's lowest point, the Puerto Rico Trench. In February 2019, he returned to the South Sandwich Trench in the Southern Ocean. He dived to the Sunda Trench in the Indian Ocean and the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean in April 2019. Vescovo's dive into the Marianas Trench proved ominous, as he discovered plastic garbage on the ocean floor. Vescovo dived to the Horizon Deep, also in the Pacific Ocean, in June 2019 and described it as pristine, with no indication of human pollution. Finally, he became the first man to dive to the Malloy Deep in the Arctic Ocean. Vescovo also traveled into space in 2022 as part of the Blue Origin NS-21 mission. Between his space mission, the 5 Deeps expedition, and his summit of Mount Everest in 2010, Vescovo became the first man to visit both the deepest and highest places on Earth, as well as outer space. He Zheng. Zheng He was a Chinese Ming dynasty admiral. He managed the Yongle Emperor's massive fleet's development. The emperor then dispatched him on a major expedition in 1405, and Zheng did not return to China until 1433. During that period, Zheng not only visited ports in countries already known to China in South and Southeast Asia, but he also traveled further afield. He visited Middle Eastern ports that Chinese merchants had previously only accessed by traveling aboard Muslim-owned ships. Zheng even arrived on the east coast of Africa about a century before European ships. His journey left a tradition of a famous treasure fleet sailing to and from China everywhere it went. This was due in part to the sheer size of the Chinese warships, which were the largest wooden vessels ever built, according to records. The Chinese also solved the problem of a lack of fresh food on long ocean trips, which Westerners would not have until contemporary refrigeration technologies were developed. The Chinese specifically designed their ships to accommodate mini-fields where soybeans and other healthy foods might flourish. Zheng's accomplishment earned him the position of military commander of Nanjing upon his return to China. He died in 1433 or 1435, and a mausoleum was built in his honor in Nanjing. However, given the nature of his achievements, Zheng's remains was buried at sea, with his empty tomb serving as a memorial. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel, since we will be covering a lot of similar content in the future. Till next time, stay curious.